Hello, welcome to Portland Works. I'd like to introduce you to Anna Lange, who is our volunteer historian, and I'm talking to her about some of the work that she's done related to Portland Works. Anna has gathered over the years a wealth of information and historical data, which she has used recently to produce her second book, Portland Works, Stainless Steel Cutlery. And I'm going to begin by asking Anna, how did you first get involved in Portland Works?
Well, actually, we were living in Durham at the time that I first heard about Portland Works, and I saw a Heritage Heroes programme on TV about the works. It must have been, I suppose, in about 2011. And when we moved at the start of 2012, I wanted to get involved. And here we are, and that's what I did.
Lovely. And what sort of jobs did you do first as a volunteer at Portland Works from 2011?
The first jobs were before we even bought Portland Works. So we went in there sort of as guests and to guide people around on open days. This was while we were still trying to get shareholders to buy the business. We had very restricted routes in very restricted and definite groups. There was no wandering around the place. It wasn't ours, and we just had to go where we had said we were going.
Okay, and what you became the volunteer historian. Had you a previous background in historical research, Anna?
Not as such, no. Peter and I both have degrees in history and archaeology, but that's going back a bit now. And we have done history while we're on holiday. I've also spent 30 years or so doing family history and researching documents for that. So, of course, there was no internet in those days. So there was that in the background, but all of this really came out about a bit by accident.
So what made you write the first Portland Works publication, which was about Robert Feed Mosley? Can you tell me a bit about that?
He was Fade Mosley, but we'll leave that for now.
Okay.
Well, quite early on, I asked Derek Morton, who was the chief guide on our open days, who was this R.F. Mosley chap then? And the answer was, I don't really know. Why don't you find out? Which was a very teacherly thing to do. But it did set me off looking. And I used my family history expertise a bit at first to help track him down. It was a couple of pages for the internet, for the website was all I did at first. And then it grew into a few more, and that's the way it went on until somebody, maybe it was Derek, said, "This is good, why don't you write a book?" So I got into the first edition of the book, which of course meant upgrading it and putting illustrations in and all sorts. But we've sold out on that now. We sold it for £3 a copy, I think. And it went out by post and by the internet and on open days and all sorts of things. And we've sold nearly 1,000 of them.
That's wonderful. Yes, that's wonderful. So can you describe how you went about collecting material to write the book? Because you said that you started to gather material and followed family history themes, but how did you find out about the man himself? Because that's sometimes quite difficult, isn't it, to get started?
Well, it always was very difficult, and it still is. And a lot of what you find out is in fact impressions and deductions rather than definite facts. I quite like Robert Mosley. Whether anybody else who lived then liked Robert Mosley, I couldn't tell you. It was a huge project, and I think that. Sorry, I've got lost halfway through the question.
It's okay. Collecting the material. How did you go about collecting the material for about Robert Mosley?
It's a big book, and it grew into a very much bigger project than the one we had at first. One of the things about publishing a first edition is that a lot of people who then know something about it come out of the woodwork and get in touch with you. And all of a sudden I had all this material that I knew and nobody else knew. And people who'd asked me to go and, you know, please will you go and talk to Auntie Margaret before she dies, sort of thing. So I had all this material and I had nowhere to put it. And I thought it's silly letting it die with me when I put all this effort into collecting it. And so it just grew and it grew and it spread out from being about Robert Mosley into being about the stainless steel industry and cutlery and the development of stainless steel and all that sort of thing.
That sounds fascinating. What decided you to start writing a second book? Because you've just published this book, which is Portland Works Stainless Steel Cutlery. And we weren't able to have the launch of the book, were we, Anna, in March because of the lockdown, which was a shame, but we have sold a considerable number of the books. Can you tell me, after your experience writing the first book, why you decided to write this second one?
Well, it needed writing to get it out there into the world, really. And there were a lot of people who were dying, and if I didn't collect it and write it up, nobody would collect it and write it up, and then the history would have gone.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get it down and to find out, and I learned all sorts of fascinating stories along the way.
Yes. So tell me a little bit about your new book. What is the main focus of it?
The main focus, well, it's the story of Portland Works and of Robert Mosley and of stainless steel, really, because Portland Works is where Harry Brearley discovered it on the other side of Sheffield, but then he brought his material to Portland Works and he said to Robert Mosley and to his cutlery manager, Ernest Stewart, can you make this into cutlery? And it took them a few tries. The first time they actually broke all the tools because it was hard, but they started to make cutlery with it. And I don't think it's saying too much to say that stainless steel changed the world.
Yes.
Because, you know, up to that point, you had to have servants to wash up your cutlery as you went, because otherwise it went rusty and had to be thrown away. You couldn't leave a knife on the draining board. It had to be washed up and dried. And stainless steel is what changed our lives.
Yes. And in the course of your research, Ada, you must have met some very interesting people. Is there anyone who's especially memorable who you've come across whilst you've been working on the book?
I think there are two people really, but I'll just talk about one, who is Annie Warburton. And Annie was nearly 90 when I met her. And she started work in Portland Works in, I think, the mid-1930s, shall we say. And she could tell me all sorts of things. But there she was, a 14-year-old girl. And at the time, there was, for the workers, there was one upstairs as well, but for the workers, there was one drinking water tap in the whole yard. And that was in the open air at the back of the yard. And one of Annie's jobs every day was to collect buckets of water and carry them 2 at a time up all those narrow staircases.
Goodness, yes.
To take them into the office, into the workspaces, so that the men in the workspaces could make a cup of tea.
Yes.
And that was her job.
Goodness
and
me.
when you think about what you would ask a 14-year-old girl to do today, I think that's just amazing.
Yes.
And she told me so much about how the works used to be when she remembered. Her granny worked there as well. So she had a lot of sort of background, as it were, at the works. And
that's amazing. Yes. It's really good that you've been able to capture that sort of information and put it into the book. And
He's
you know,
died now. I wouldn't have, it's that information has gone.
yes, yes, yeah. I think that's really good that we're able to look back and appreciate her memories. And so people who want to know more about Portland Works need to buy a copy of the book, I think, and make sure that they've had a look at all the other stories and information that you've put in there that you've collected from people, because it is truly fascinating.
There is so much in there that wasn't in the first book.
Yes.
Even if you could still get the first book, because we've pretty much sold out. But there is a lot in there.
Yes.
And it's not just, you see, about past workers and about the history of stainless steel and all that sort of thing. It's also got stories about workers after Robert Mosley. So there's the continued history of the Mosley Company until the 1960s. There's all the other people who've been in Portland Works. Some of them are still in existence elsewhere in Sheffield, or even still in the works. Some of them aren't. But all those stories, when you gather them together, and this is still this is not just still, this is now the only Victorian integrated cutlery works still being used for making cutlery. And you might think it isn't, but actually there are 2 or 3 of our tenants who make knives.
Yes.
And so they are making cutlery, not the same cutlery.
But it's still going on, isn't it? Yes.
Still going on. And the forge is still going. The forge is amazing.
Yes. And it's the original one, isn't it, from 1879? Yes, that's
It's
still
the original
operational.
forge with a lot of the original machinery still in it, not necessarily connected the same way, but all the wheels and the pulleys and everything are still there in the forge. And Andy has been working there since the 1960s, I think.
Mm.
So he knew the last of the Mosleys, and he has carried on working the forge. And it's the only one in the built-up area of Sheffield.
Yes, so it's a shame people can't come and visit on this Heritage Open Day Festival, but as soon as it's possible, then we will have people back to come and have a look around and experience Portland Works for themselves, because there's something about stepping into the works that that atmosphere gets you hooked, and people want to come back time after time, don't they?
Practically everybody walks in and sort of says, wow,
yes,
I didn't know it was like this. I didn't know how big it was. I didn't know all sorts of things, but they just go, wow.
Yes, yeah.
And
so
it's old.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is old. What's the most exciting discovery you've made, Anna, whilst you were writing this book?
I think it's got to be my own personal discovery about Alexander Clark, which I have to say was helped by a retired professor in Manchester called Jeff Tweedale, who was, we had a really good working relationship going. But he was a real encourager, a bit like Derek was originally an encourager. Jeff was as well. And he found an Alexander Clark catalogue with loads of pictures of Portland Works, because Alexander Clark worked in Portland Works, and on the pictures he wrote Welbeck Works, Alexander Clark, all over it. In those days there was no Trade Descriptions Act. He was free to do that. It's maybe a good job that we're not still free to do that, just to choose a nice building at random and put our labels all over it, you know.
Yes.
But until then, we didn't know where Mosley had his catalogues. We didn't know where he sold stuff. We didn't know that he'd had this 20-year real connection with Alexander Clark. They were directors of each other's companies. You know, it wasn't just a minor friendship. Alexander Clark moved. No, he didn't move to Sheffield. Sorry, that was somebody else. Cut that bit out. But Alexander Clark and Robert Mosley really got on well. And they were colleagues, partners in crime, if you like, for about 20 years, maybe more.
Mm. You spoke about the catalogue of Alexander Clark's goods. Can you still see that catalogue? Is it still available?
There is still a copy at Portland Works, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
After the one that Jeff sent me some photocopies from, we went looking, and I had people out in auction houses and all sorts of things saying, can you find me? And somebody did at Sheffield Auction Gallery. And we bought it, and it was in a terrible condition. We had it rebound, and it's now handleable with care, but we keep it locked up in a room at Portland Works so that it's not vulnerable to damage or anything like that.
Yeah, so it's very very valuable to everybody at Portland Works to look back and see the sort of things that were being made at the works. Yes,
beautiful things.
Yes.
And one of the really amazing things is the silversmithing was all done in the bit that we now call the basement. And the light is awful, and the damp is awful. And that's where the silversmiths were, producing the most amazing work.
Yes, it does help you imagine what it must have been like for people at that time, doesn't it? So, yes, much harder lives, I think, than we have now. But the things that they produced were, as you say, really beautiful, and a huge number of things in the catalogue is awe-inspiring, isn't it? Really, to think that all those things were being produced by this partnership of Clark.
Yeah, well, yes, some of it was being produced by Alexander Clark in London.
Yes.
The reason that he called it Welbeck Works was that he already had a Portland Works in London. So he didn't want to call it Portland Works, he'd already got one.
Yes.
So, okay, Welbeck is another good Portlandy type name. Let's just know this. So the poor postman had an old old Portland Works on West Street, the new Portland Works in Randall Street, and that one was called Welbeck Works as well. I mean, how as a postman do you cope with that lot?
Yes, yeah. Well, you've unravelled it, Anna, so that's helps us to understand how complicated it was. So the insight that you've given us this afternoon is just a very short glimpse of what Portland Works has to offer, and you've told us a lot about the past. What are your hopes for the future of Portland Works?
Well, it must be that we'll continue to tell the story of stainless steel and provide a good and fairly inexpensive place. We can't provide expensive office accommodation. You know, we've got leaky Victorian windows and we're grade 2-star listed. You know, you have to live with what you've got. But it's for working businesses, and especially metal workers, it's a really good place to come, and it's a very friendly place. If you haven't got a bit of equipment, you can ask Fred in the next workshop, yeah, how do I do this? And if Fred can help you, he will.
So it's sort of come.
Anybody by saying Fred.
No, I think it sort of comes full circle, hasn't it, from when the factory was first set up, and the sort of trades that were happening there and the skills that were being used. It's come full circle because many of the people now that you've referred to, knife makers, are still there, and they're still using those skills in their workshops. So that's
just knives, you see, it's handles and so many. There were cutlery cases, you know, all these beautiful canteens and cutlery boxes and things. A lot of them were made there as well, because there were people there who would make it. Everything that Mosley needed,
yes, was on one site. Yes,
or very nearby.
Yes,
where to get it from.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you, Anna. I mean, you've given us a really good insight into how you've become involved in the works and what fascinates you so much about the history. And I do hope that people will have enjoyed listening to you speaking this afternoon about your work, and that they will consider having a closer look by purchasing your book, and better still coming to Portland Works as well and having a look round when it's safe to do so. So thank you very much, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you for asking me.
Okay.